Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Join me here, Racquel. Have a seat. Great to be back with everybody who is here in the room and all of you following us online. In fact, I think it's morning in the Caribbean now.
Yeah.
So our timing for bringing the Caribbean to the stage here in Dubai is perfect. It's great to be with all of you joining us here in person and online to have a discussion about small island developing states. And we've got two people who bring a lot of expertise on the issues of renewable energy and energy efficiency and the particular needs of small island developing states in the Caribbean and beyond to the conversation today. Joseph Williams is here. He's a coordinator for energy efficiency and renewable energy at the Caribbean Development Bank. Nice to see you, Joseph. And then Racquel Moses is the CEO at the Caribbean Climate-Smart Accelerator.
Yeah.
So let's just begin with what's unique about the region that the two of you are from. I was on stage with Mia Mottley, Prime Minister Mia Mottley, just a couple of weeks ago at the Paris Peace Forum, and I said, it's like all roads lead to Barbados nowadays. It's a country of what, 280,000 people? And suddenly it is in the driver's seat, even here at this COP, right? Pushing the whole world to rethink our commitments to climate. What is it about the experience of the Caribbean that you want people to know about? What is it about the unique issues and characteristics that you face? Maybe I'll just start with you, Joseph, if I can, since you live in Barbados.
Sure, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Well, I'd like to talk about the energy of the people. Because I think as Caribbean people, we're full of life, and also quite resilient, which is important in the context of the vulnerabilities that we face. Right?
You need that when hurricanes roll through and all the other challenges in the region.
So that being said, from the energy system standpoint, there are many challenges, but some of them unique. We have a situation where we have very, very small systems, isolated, and relatively larger ones. And then we have countries that are part of the continental mass, South America, Central America. So even though we're all small island states or low-lying coastal states, there are, differences. And so that also adds to the challenges and how we respond to them. So we're common, but there are differences that makes some of the responses and the solutions that a little bit more complex in terms of how we relate to them. But certainly what is very common and what is a big challenge is the vulnerability in terms of the climate as well as disaster risk. For us, every year, we know that there will be some disaster event. It's a question of who will be this time, the intensity of it, and so on. But we almost are sure
But you know something's coming every year.
You have to live with that reality, be able to plan for that, and that requires resources and a range of other things that we have to find ways to be responsive.
Yeah, so one of the unique characteristics of the region is that vulnerability, which as you say, there's some diversity, Central American, low-lying land states that are part of the continental mass, but others that are islands, but kind of all of them face that challenge, right? And then there is some diversity around how energy is generated in some of these countries. Some places, you're from Trinidad, have fossil fuel resources, and others have none and have to import everything. Talk to us, if you can, Racquel, a little bit about that energy picture and what the situation is like in the Caribbean.
Sure. So we have a really diverse energy mix. And if you think about all of the ways that you can generate renewables, whether it's hydro, whether it's solar, whether it's wind, whether it's geothermal, we have all of it, right? And so that's amazing because certain islands are better suited to certain energy mixes, and we're looking at that across the region. But the commonality that Joseph pointed out is that vulnerability. And according to the IMF, 40% of the losses from climate-related events have happened in our region. And if you think about it, the carbon in the atmosphere produced wealth that we don't have access to. So it means that we're dealing with the brunt of the challenges without the funding, the associated revenue to address these challenges. So we have to use this energy transition, not just as a carbon mitigation issue, because it's a non-issue for us outside of Trinidad, where per capita we produce quite a bit of emissions. Outside of that, Our emissions, it just doesn't register, right? But it is this energy transition is an economic opportunity for us to participate in this global transformation.
Yeah.
And that is the perspective from which we approach it.
Well, Guyana might register one day.
Not yet, not yet.
Not yet.
Not yet,
but
but
that's
they will
the exception
eventually.
that proves the rule. That Guyana and Trinidad are the exception. Because as you say, for the most part, countries in this region are not responsible at all for the climate change that the world is experiencing, but are getting the brunt of it. So what do we do about this? Like when you're at the Caribbean Development Bank, Joseph, how do you see the strategy? Because what Prime Minister Mia Mottley talks often about is that these countries are stuck. They're too rich for concessional finance. There isn't enough patient capital available for these kind of large transition investments that are required. So they're sort of stuck in this gray zone. How do you see it?
Yeah, sure. So, Racquel mentioned the diversity of the options we have, but the reality is that a lot of it is at the potential level. So the resources are yet to be fully developed, right? We have made significant strides, for example, in geothermal in terms of helping to de-risk that. But we haven't yet had a plant. I mean, we had some very good news over this COP that there was for one of the countries that's way ahead, they've just signed some agreements that will move to plant construction phase, which is very exciting for us because to the extent that we get that first plant, it will really...
And where will that be?
Pardon me?
Where will that be?
Oh, Dominica. That's Dominica.
Okay,
right.
Dominica, okay.
But back to your question. One of the challenges we face, well, there are many challenges, but among them, the issue of scale in terms of how you really get investors to be interested in these small markets. And so for us, it's really about how we are going to find ways to aggregate some of those projects. Solar is pretty much, wide scale in terms of its the manifestation of the resource, but they have small markets. And so the question is, how do we aggregate so that we can get the kind of credible, experienced investors to support? And we say investors, international as well as regional and local, right?
Yeah.
But where we come in, we're really trying to see how we can, one, help to establish the framework that can give the investor confidence. Because we have established that much of the capital that's needed will have to come from the private sector. So that's a given. So the question is, how do we help the countries, the markets, to have that framework that provides that confidence? That's very, very important. And then also providing the kind of instruments that can support the projects at the different stages. And I keep saying, I repeat myself in this regard, that not all renewable energy options are created equal, right? So some of the instruments in need for geothermal are a little different from solar and aggregation. And wind is a special experience we have had, and we can talk about all of that. And then there are other options, but they are at different stages. So for us as a bank, we have some resources to do some things, but it's about finding the appropriate resources to match those risks and challenges and helping with that de-risking process. And in that context, we also play an intermediary role. So we are accredited to say the GCF, the Adaptation Fund, the EU SIF. And so to that extent, to the extent that we can understand the challenges, design the instruments to help to make it happen, I think we have an important role there.
So you can get some grant money from the Green Climate Fund, you can mix it with some loans that you can provide, and then ideally attract a private sector partner to come and invest.
Sure. But also debt too, because for example, with the geothermal, getting that PPA price that makes sense for the population is a very important part.
Right, that power purchase agreement.
Right. So we have been able to develop models that allow us to access. As we are doing now, we are hoping to do in, say, Dominica. We are now looking at that project, appraising that project to provide some funding. But the concessionality, so the approach that is taken is that the concessionality passes straight through to the end user. So it's not a question of the concessionality benefiting the private developer. And we have to be very careful about how we manage that process. And so we have developed models that allows us to have that conversation and also implement it. So it's grant, very important, because in some cases, to enable the governments to participate. They need to have a stake, especially in some of these bigger projects where they have to facilitate and what it means for the country and the resource and the risk and how they have to participate. But for them to participate, we have to find a way to be able to help them to do that, and that's where the grant comes in. So we would put some grant resources in there to help de-risk.
Yep.
But that grant resource can then become equity for the government in a kind of PPP arrangement. And that's one approach. So it's both grant and debt, but it's about how you design the approaches to make it most effective and then to expedite and accelerate the process.
Yeah, this kind of financial engineering is key to the success of these projects. Racquel, what do you think when you talk to private investors? Because you're at that intersection of trying to bring in private money. Why are they investing when they invest? Why are they not when they're not? What is the barrier?
That's such a great question. So what we've been finding is that, and we launched our Climate-Smart map last week, which is a way for investors, philanthropists, and project developers to aggregate projects across the region to address this issue of scale that we've not had, right? So it allows you to look at several islands with similar characteristics and evaluate your criteria through a map lens and decide on what are the investments that you want to make. What we have realized in our work since our inception is that, we have a lot of projects and we have a lot of investors who are ready, but somehow they're just not connecting. And we realize that we have a lot of shovel-worthy, but not necessarily shovel-ready projects. And there's a chasm that they need to cross to be ready. We find that when we work with people like Caribbean Development Bank, we can help to do that. There are lots of project preparation facilities that are available. And so getting projects through that, when there is a good policy framework, so CDB with CCSA, we're working on that, making sure that we're evaluating the policy framework, because where the policies are solid and conducive to investment, you see far more investment taking place in those places versus the places where there's some ambiguity around the policies and investors find the level of risk in comparison to the level of reward too high.
I mean, this is like electric utilities, let's say, that are not charging the real price of power to the end consumer. Is that the kind of problem you're seeing, so that an investor says, how am I really going to recapture my investment here?
That can be the problem, when the utility, so I don't want to call out specific markets. So in some markets, for example, you have high levels of theft on the grid, and that makes the cost of electricity that you have to pay much higher than the real cost of electricity that you have to pay. In other places, it's highly subsidized. And so there's an issue with that because you can't make your money back. There are other places where they're saying we're open to investment and they want somebody to come in and invest, but they haven't set the price as to what you can expect in the power purchase agreement. So it's very, very difficult. And then you have other places where just to explore the resources, especially in the geothermal countries, just to explore the resources are so costly compared to the local usage that it makes no sense unless you're producing those renewables for an offtake for some other purpose.
Right.
So we have no end of opportunities, options, and challenges.
And underlining the last one. You're smiling, Joseph.
Yeah, if I could just come in on that point, because I think the point Racquel made just now comes back to the point that I made earlier about the diversity in terms of some of the challenges. So it seems pretty small. I mean, for us, we have 19 board member countries. You have Jamaica, Trinidad, Barbados, a little bit more developed market, but you have some tiny markets, 50,000 people, still very important in the mix.
Yeah.
They're still our members.
Right.
Their challenges are a little bit
small
from some of those, right? So the point about the utility and the technical and financial health is an important one, but that's one of a number of, and it depends on the nature of the project. And the way we think about the private sector, and this again comes back to the issue of inclusivity. It's international, bigger, established investor, it's institutional, but it's also the domestic consumers. So the question is, how do you get the gamut of those to participate? And in some cases, at the lower end of the market, we're talking about distributed generation and to get the householder to install and so on. It's about instruments that they make it easy for them. So for example, there's an approach we're working on called the integrated utilities model, services model. And what that does, it allows us to channel, so work with the utilities to implement a kind of ESCO model approach, where the small business, MSME, or the domestic consumer could access the service, have an installation, and then pay through their utility bill over time, amortize that. So they're an investor, and we have to cater for them too. So the issue, what we have found is that when it comes to the framework, it can present a very complex picture for the governments and the utilities. And so recently, we developed what we call a minimum regulatory function. And we're seeking to answer the question, what is the minimum set of critical conditions that need to be present within a market that can give investor confidence? And so that you have mentioned is one of them. The question of the utility, the credibility, the tariff, the issue of some
Dealing with theft, if there's a lot of electricity theft happening.
among others. And we look at some of the instrument citing issues, the instruments in terms of the grid feeding mechanism, whether it's net billing, feeding tariff, which once you have those things set up, you deal with different segments of the market. And you also have the framework for the larger investors, treating with those things that are important. So it's not a panacea, but what it does is give the country something to begin to work with, to say, look, all of the things that need to be done, trying to understand what is best suited for my market. At least there are some things I can begin to implement that can move me very quickly to another level. So
Yeah.
it's a range of things. Thank you.
Joseph said there's not a panacea, but Racquel, why can't everybody just do microgrid solar in the region? Why can't you put a solar panel on every house and a battery? Why is that not realistic?
Because that doesn't take into consideration the complexity of our region and our policies, and in some places you're not even allowed yet to generate your own electricity. So it's simpler said than done. Some of these countries have signed agreements with private developers where it's a take or pay. So yeah, you can say, yeah, everybody put on a grid, and then the government still has to pay the utility for the power that they're not buying. So, so there is a transition that needs to take place from where each country or territory is to the ideal state. And I know that CDB is doing a lot of work in ushering at least their borrowing member countries along that path.
But I think it's a very, very good question. And that's part of our imagination too, because we have to kind of help everybody to understand the possibilities. But Racquel has said it well. You really have legacy issues. And the fact is the utility, remember, is integrated monopoly utility that have license and how you transition. So even though some of the countries are creative in terms of how they open up that market space. So for example, they may open it up for generation for renewable energy. But the utility has a big role and an incumbent role. But then you also talk about the network itself, the T&D network, and how you treat with some of those if all the generation goes and who pays for that cost.
Right.
So there are a number of issues there that have to be worked out, and some of it, unfortunately, have to be done on a country-by-country basis because even though they're common, there are different.
Well, it's interesting because a lot of us in this room and watching online focus on the biggest countries in the world, right?
Yes.
Markets like Nigeria and India. And it's interesting that while there are some unique challenges to massive scale countries, there's also unique challenges to really small countries. And as you say, governments, from a perspective of national security, want to have a utility. And if everybody has a solar panel and they can sell their power back or they don't have to buy power, how does that utility stay in business? And who's footing the bill?
And maintain the infrastructure that's already aging in many of these islands and subject to damage as well. And
So there's a big movement, I mentioned Prime Minister Mia, there's a big movement to reform the multilateral development bank system. Your accelerator is funded through the Inter-American Development Bank, your own regional development bank. When you think about this movement, what do you expect it to do differently, these banks in the region, in the Caribbean region? How will it actually play out?
I'd love to see them operate with a little more agility, for sure, because I think, they get frustrated, the development partners get frustrated about how quickly the region moves, but they don't move as quickly as they should either to facilitate the transition that they'd like to see.
The World Bank President Ajay Banga says it's been years to develop one World Bank project as an example.
And I mean, we don't have that kind of time. You know, we're talking about 2030 like it's 20 years away.
Right.
2030 is less than 7 years away. We
Yeah.
really need to.
That's the average time for a World Bank project, so that means you get one.
Yeah.
What about you? So we heard agility.
Yeah, so, well, I think there are a number of issues, but some of them that are top of the list have to do with things like how we treat with development versus climate finance, and the whole question of the vulnerability being common, all. And the fact is that it's very difficult to really make that distinction when we come to the development is directly linked to or the issues around development directly linked to the vulnerabilities, right?
Yeah.
And it's very difficult.
You mean countries like Barbados are too rich, basically, otherwise? to get-
Well, that's the case that's made, but we don't necessarily buy that case because
Yeah.
in all of the countries that are deemed to be upper income and so on, based on their GDP per capita, in all those cases, when you look at the vulnerability, there are significant
Right.
pockets of poverty and issues that don't necessarily reflect in those, right? But I'm also saying, when a country is hit, that has significant poverty impact.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's not just about the infrastructure and climate. And I'm saying it's difficult to separate them.
Right.
Right.
So that's the first big issue for us, because when we engage and we said, okay, only ODA eligible countries, we have to, as a bank, make the case for the countries,
Yeah.
because there are some realities and we have to present the data. So there's that. But there's also the question of how we treat with the impacts, you know, the shocks and so on, and how those are treated in terms of the debt and repayments and so on. And for us to do and afford some of those facilities to countries, it means that we also have to have that facility in the context of the international architecture.
Yeah, and I mean, CDB launched not last year, but their recovery duration adjuster, just saying that you have to assess countries based on their vulnerability. You can't just say, well, your GDP per capita is high, because one hurricane can come through and wipe out everything.
Yeah.
And then what does that mean? And so if they wanted to borrow to build their resilience, and then they don't get that opportunity, then a hurricane comes, then everybody's like, what do you need to recover? Well, no, I don't need to recover. I needed to build my resilience.
Right. Which
so
would have
that-
been much cheaper.
Which would have been much cheaper, so that I would have had less damage.
Well, we're going to end on that point because it's a great one, but we've run out of time. But I'm glad that we brought the Caribbean on this stage here in Dubai, and that we've underlined the issues around an energy transition, how complex they are, and why this new era in climate finance has to look really different than the
Yeah.
last one. So please join me
Sure.
in thanking our panelists, Joseph Williams and Racquel Moses.
And thank you, Raj.